Hey guys, so moving on, in the second video, we're going to talk about the next section in the textbook, Virginia Civics and Economics, Chapter 1, Section 2. So if you have the book, if you're following along with us, please feel free to read along. This section talks about these SOL standards, and we're going to focus on the last one in this video, practice courtesy and respect for the rights of others. So the vocabulary of this section is immigrants, discrimination, racism, exclusion laws, and census. And next we're going to focus particularly on the first two vocabulary words. So immigrants are people who move from one country to make their homes in another. You can think of it as, people who move from Mexico to make their home in the United States. People who move from Europe to make their home in Africa. So stop the video now and write on your own piece of paper, your answer to the question, are you an American? Immigrant? Why or why not? Or do you know if your parents or your grandparents are an immigrant? Why or why not? Discrimination is the unfair treatment of a group of people compared with another group. So the story so far, what we discussed about in the last video, was part of being a citizen means you want to try to meet the needs of your community, and that demography helps you know the needs of your community. But now the question is, who makes up our community? Who are we? And we're going to try to answer that question in this video today. So part of the idea of American identity, who are Americans, is that we sort of thought maybe Americans are a giant melting pot. The term suggests that people from all over the world came to America and melted into our society, giving up their cultural traditions from their native lands. So stop the video, and on your own piece of paper answer the question, is the United States a melting pot? Why or why not? Another way to think about who are Americans, what is our identity, is to think of us as a giant mosaic. The idea is, instead of all of us losing our culture while blending together in one pot, we fit together like the pieces of a mosaic. And mosaics, you can think of them as giant puzzles. So puzzles have individual pieces that you fit together in the right ways to become a part of a larger picture whole. And mosaics are just individual pieces of tile or paper that you sort of fit together in the right way to become part of a larger picture. And the idea is that just like each of these pieces are critical to forming the entire picture, each one of you are critical in forming the entire picture of what it means to be an American. So each one of our cultures matter. That's a famous mosaic in history. You'll learn about this a little bit more in World History 1 in high school. So now that we've talked about who are Americans, what are we all about, we're going to talk about different parts of American society. These different parts are called ethnicities, different cultures. You sometimes see them on a test when you have to mark, I am African American, or I am Caucasian, or I am European Americans. So we're going to start with Europe. European Americans first came from England to America, and then from other parts of Europe. Their motivations to come were economic opportunity, religious and political freedom, to escape economic hardship at home. They settled in communities and locations that reminded them at home. So for example, people from Sweden settled up north because sort of the weather and the environment and the people they were around reminded them of Sweden. The immigrants who came were very diverse, so it ranged from the highly educated, politicians even, to people who couldn't read. So I want you guys to stop the video now and think about and answer the question on your paper. When you think of Europeans now, what comes to mind? Why? So this picture reflects the Irish potato famine, and it was in Ireland. Potatoes weren't doing so well. They weren't growing as well as they needed to be. So we had a lot of immigrants come from Ireland because just economic hardship at home. They couldn't grow food. We also had a lot of immigrants come because they were sort of bullied at home. In England, there was this group called the Puritans, and they were sort of bullied by this other group called the Anglicans or the Church of England. And they just sort of fled that and went to America because they could worship whoever or whatever they wanted in peace. So next we're going to talk about the next ethnographic group, the next cultural group, Hispanic Americans. And in history, Hispanic Americans came from Spanish-held lands in Florida, Mexico, Texas, Louisiana, and California. So you learn about this a little bit in World History 1 and 2 when you get there. But Spain also colonized, put people in America just like Britain did. So Hispanic Americans make up now the largest language minority group in the United States. And they influence U.S. culture dramatically. So think, would we have Taco Bell if they weren't around in America? Would we have Ricky Martin if they weren't around in America? Probably less likely. Finally, African Americans came here as slaves initially. So a lot of Europeans brought them over or bought them, and African Americans would work on plantations, on farms, growing crops, growing cotton, and these European Americans often would give them housing and clothes and food, but it was not a rich existence. It was pretty meager. And they are well known in our history for having suffered discrimination, particularly at the hands of European Americans. They were unfairly treated. So discrimination came from racism, and racism means a belief that members of your own race are superior to other races. So if you think about it, racism is, it could be, what it's typically thought of in our history of America today as, white people thinking that they're superior to African Americans. But it doesn't always have to be that way. The term racism simply means that beliefs that your own race is superior to other races. So an Asian American might think that all Asians are superior to all white people, or an African American might think all African Americans are superior to every other race. Racism applies equally. So what did racism and discrimination look like? Well, African Americans were banned from voting, from attending schools with white students, from living in neighborhoods with whites, from going to certain hotels, and had to sit in the back of the bus. So this is sort of our history with African Americans as Americans. We did not treat them well in our history. And just a picture of an example of racism. So many people think discrimination has not been resolved today. But then some people argue that it has been resolved because even now, African Americans can become president. Stop the video now and answer the question, what do you think? What moments of discrimination do you still see in your community today? It's a picture of Barack Obama. Asian Americans, they came initially to America because of gold. Then they developed stores and restaurants to meet the needs of miners. Then they prospered in business and farming. But this prospering made a lot of people mad, and so America passed exclusion laws in our history from 1882 to 1907 that basically said we're not accepting any more Chinese, Japanese, Indian people into our country. They cannot immigrate. We won't let them. So that's a picture of gold. And then part of the reason why Asian Americans were sort of discriminated in this way is that they were successful in taking European Americans' jobs because they were willing to work for less. And so many people in different states got upset because they lost their jobs. And one of the traditions that Asian Americans have brought to the United States now and just is popular in the United States now is Chinese food. So think about this: when you go to Panda Express, when you go to other Chinese restaurants in your local vicinity, that food, while it's tailored to American taste, tailored to you, its history, its origin is sort of from China. And finally, the last culture we're going to talk about is Native Americans. These were the first Americans living in America, and they competed with Europeans when Europeans came. And so, due to disease, war, poor economic conditions, and discrimination, many Americans, Native Americans, now are pushed far away from where their tribes originated in America. And this picture illustrates an example of that. It's called the Trail of Tears, and it was a moment in our history of America where we forcibly removed Native Americans from their original location to move into what is now modern-day Oklahoma. So conclusion, our population today. Typically, our government does what's called a census, a survey of our population done every 10 years. And it's done in every culture in history. You see it everywhere. It's done to aid tax collection and government management of a society. And it has shown that the United States is becoming much more diverse. We're not a culture of Europeans anymore. We're a culture of Europeans, Indians, African, Asians, Hispanics, just everybody. So I want you to take a look at these personal traits of good citizens and write them down in your notes. Then I want you to ask yourself the following question. Which one of these traits, when you practice it, is aided by the knowledge of where people come from, the knowledge of these different sort of histories and cultures? For example, is patriotism, is your love of country, love of the United States, aided by your knowledge of our history when we dealt with Hispanics or African Americans or Asians? Is your respect for the law aided by your knowledge of where Americans have come from? Is your participation in a school and local community aided by the history of the different ethnicities in our society? Why? Take a moment, stop the video, and answer that question.